It started with the Easybeats conquering the teeny boppers in the innocent 60s. Australian rock and roll on the brink of worldwide fame. But in the 70s, everything changed. The hippie wave rolled in and then out. All that was left was an endless recession and a lot of young people who were over the bullshit. A tough, new generation of Australians was looking for its sound. One man would lead the charge. He wanted to take the raw Australian guitar sound to the world. He would build a musical dynasty. This is how it happened. This is the story of blood and of thunder. In 1973, songwriters Harry Vanda and George Young returned to Australia. It was the start of a new era as they reunited with their mentor, studio boss Ted Albert. From the ashes of the Easybeats, this unlikely partnership had unfinished business.
As a continuation of what the Easybeats could have been, they were going to produce something and deliver it to the rest of the world.
How do you nurture talent? Be trusted implicitly in George and Harry's judgment, because they were the eldest sons. And I thought, you know, that's a clever man, a clever father.
When you went up to Albert's in King Street, there were these two young immigrant guys that had the latest technology, everything they wanted to do what they wanted to do, which is to write and produce songs. So they were given an incredible opportunity, but also they delivered. I mean, they delivered like no one else.
The next 10 years would belong to Albert's as they nurtured a family of local talent and dominated the Australian charts. But it didn't stop at our shores. This was the decade when the Australian sound captured the world. It all started in the grotty, sticky pubs of the suburbs.
We played at the White Horse Inn in Victoria, and there was guys bashing their head on the edge of the stage. I saw one guy bite the corner out of a jug.
They can be frustrating audiences to play to because they're hammered. In a room full of alcoholics, it's very difficult to make any sense to them.
The only language this crowd understood was volume, and the guitars did the shouting.
When you play in the pubs in this country, you get that big, fat, straight, four on the floor, as they call it. It's boom, boom, bang, boom, boom, that thing, right? Because in a pub, you'd have 2,000 people absolutely packed. It's so hot, everyone's sweating, you're sweating. You've got to get them off. They're all pissed.
Australian culture at the time was raw. It was pretty raw in the pubs. And so that sound of a guitar, with not much else on it, but plenty of grunt behind it, worked very well in those places.
George and Harry could sense an opportunity.
When we first heard the rock bands in Australia, I heard some stuff on the radio, and I thought, that's not very good, is it? This is like, it all sounded squashed and horrible, you know what I mean? Like, no life in it. And then we went around to clubs and the pubs and started to look at, you know, like, started to look at some of the guys, and all of a sudden, that's not the same band that's on record, you know? I mean, these guys were great. They were rocking their asses off. They said, well, that's how you got to record these guys.
It became their mission to capture that raw guitar sound on record. Luckily for them, the answer was right under their noses. George Young knew that his little brothers, Malcolm and Angus, had something special that they could nurture.
George always talked to me and Mal, we were his kid brothers. Still does, you know, he still talks to you like you. Well, he says it himself. He goes, geez, I always think of you as 15, you know, so. Oh, thanks.
Okay, people, we're going to have a rave-up. We'd like to do the Payday song. Friday on my mind.
Angus, the seventh son of William and Margaret Young, always wanted to be a guitar hero. He'd grown up watching older brother George and Uncle Harry Vander perform. He was intrigued by how they played the guitar.
They had a very good sound, you know. They had a kind of unique thing between him and Harry, you know. And Harry was probably doing a bit like what I do with, same with as Malcolm, you know. You know, George had that very hard rhythm, and, you know, Harry provided, you know, the highlights, the kind of color. So, yeah, you know, there's a big similarity.
By the time they hit their teens, Malcolm and Angus were already mean guitarists. Older sister Margaret came up with the name ACDC from a sign on the family sewing machine. Angus was still at school, but Malcolm, the band leader, let him loose on lead guitar. They had a bulletproof conviction they were going to be huge.
A friend and I went and saw ACDC at the Deacon Inn one Wednesday or Thursday night, and we were about 6 people in the audience.
Ted had been watching the boys for years and signed them in 1974. In the next year, they went through 2 drummers, 3 bass players and 3 managers. But it was the new singer that got the motor running. It's hard to believe that among this company of dags lurked the future frontman of the biggest hard rock band on earth. But that's Bon Scott, with the twinkle in his eye, miming backup vocals on a Vander and Young song for the Valentines in 1969.
The Valentines with My Old Man's a Groovy Old Man. Vince,
Thanks very much.
welcome back to the program.
Bon was considerably older. He was more experienced. He'd, you know, been in fraternity. He'd also been in pop groups in the 60s. He'd had a measure of success. And he'd kind of blown it. His career had petered out. He'd had a terrible motorcycle accident not long before. He was down on his luck.
At 28, Bon was working as a roadie in Adelaide when ACDC rolled into town.
They just found him hugely entertaining because he didn't give a shit, but really didn't give. And finally, one night, after some bust-up with Dave Evans, their original singer, they invite Bon to come on and kind of audition. And famously, Bon did a gram of coke, drank a bottle of whiskey, put his wife's knickers on his head, and just ran around the stage like a lunatic and entertained the hell out of the audience.
George Young described Bon as a toilet wall poet. His bawdy lyrics would become the perfect foil for the fierce guitar sound of the Youngs. He was filthy, but he was funny. Ted Albert didn't judge artists on their appearance or their wild behaviour. To him, all that mattered was that Bon was right for the band.
Dr. Oliver Sacks said in his book, The Man That Mistook His Wife for a Hat, that judgment is the most important thing we have. That judgment defines our identity. And I think what Ted had was he had judgment and he backed it. And he had the money to back it. He had the machinery to back it. But he gambled on his instinct to pick talent.
Albert's enforcer, FIFA Riccobono, was in the crowd for Bon's first official gig at the Rockdale Masonic Hall in Sydney, 1974.
was a full house, and I was really excited. And then he got up and he comes down the front of the stage, and he is so crass and so rude. And the crowd went berserk. They really liked it. And I thought, God, he's so good, but he's so bad.
From the start, the pubs loved them. Their producers got to know it firsthand. George and Harry brought ACDC into the studio straight after the gigs to capture that raw pub energy.
You just had to give them a chance to perform, you know, give them a chance to do it. Instead of, you know, say, well, the needle must not go into the red. So that's how this so-called pub sound came about, because that's what it sounded like in the pubs.
The boys were bursting with raw energy and talent. George and Harry were born producers. It helped that George was their older brother.
Working with George and Harry, you know, everything seems to be in his head for a lot of times, you know. And because he'll take something you got, he'll go, well, let's hear what you got. And you play him your song, and he'll go, oh, let's try this that way. Yeah. And he's already crafting away in his head, and he'll go, no, let's change it. And I'll go, oh, wait a minute, it sounds good. You know, it sounds great. And you go, no, we'll just try this. You know? So he seems to just create things in his head.
Between them, they hit on a landmark sound. Rebellious and rocking, it would one day take on the world.
Wow, Bond's cheeky and he's trouble, and I want to be his mate. I mean, Angus is just this whirling dervish and just so beautiful. And Malcolm, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. His right hand is just... Oh, whoa.
For an audience sick of hard times, here was the cure. Suburban young Australia at full bore. The Albert sound would speak for them.
One of the things that's notable about the whole Albert stable in those days was we all had what they call the Australian pub rock sound, that big, fat, robust guitar sound. And it was very, very difficult to get the intensity of that onto tape. George and Harry were magicians at that.
Sometimes we would finish, you know, late night in a club or something, and George would say, well, you know, get you in the studio now, you know, and we'd be doing, you know, doing tracks. And, I mean, sometimes you could roll out of there at 4 in the morning, and other times you might roll out at 1 o'clock in the day, you know, and you'd been there all night.
After an all-nighter, their way to come down was to jump in a tinny and go fishing on the harbour. Ted Albert also loved the water. Sometimes they went out together. Now Harry and George had founded the Albert's rock sound. Ted set sail for the pop charts. It started with John Paul Young. They wrote a top 10 hit for him in 1975 about being yesterday's heroes.
When I walk down the streets, see the people who stop and stare and say, haven't I seen that face somewhere a long time ago?
It was George singing about his own experiences of leaving the Easybeats and somehow the public still recognising him from somewhere but couldn't quite put their finger on it, and that happens to be now. It's great, you know, people say, oh, you're don't tell me, and I say, no, I won't.
It was some strange wonder that the same company, with the same producers, in the same studio, could turn out ACDC one day and JPY the next.
Jump in my car.
Ted Mulry wrote pop songs, but Albert's got them rocking.
Jump in my car. I wanna take you home.
The Generals were watching,
It's too far to walk on your own.
and an army of fans was gathering.
Alberts were a fascination to a lot of the bands, and particularly us, because they just produced not only hits, but they produced a sound. There was magic there, and you felt it in there, but it wasn't to do with the equipment.
They started to build up, you know, a portfolio of, you know, titles that you could say, oh, they wrote that, they produced that, they wrote and produced that, they wrote and produced that, and very quickly they became the #1 writing team in Australia. Very quickly.
In the mid-70s, colour TV arrived, and with it, Countdown became the new battleground for popular music.
They gave us the Easybeats. They gave us the brilliance of George and Harry. They then gave us John Paul Young, Ted Mulry, William Shakespeare was another one. And they not only gave it to the Australian public, they gave it to Countdown, and we loved it.
I left foot, come on.
Alberts was soon supplying 25% of the Countdown artists.
If it hadn't have been for Alberts, and I can absolutely safely say this, then Countdown only would have lasted, at the most, I reckon, 6 months.
When rock and roll's sister act Cheetah signed with Alberts, it was straight to work.
There was no ceremony when we actually signed the deal with Ted. And then we were scuttled straight downstairs to where George was waiting with a little keyboard in a very small room. And we just got straight into it. He said, sing this, and we sort of went straight into a few tunes. So I think he was probably sort of testing our guns vocally to see what we had there.
Looking after them was Fifa Riccobono, by the mid-70s, head of the Alberts stable of artists, the toughest woman in rock.
She could be ruthless and a piranha when she needed to be, and yet, you know, she'd be standing there behind one of these holding a brush and a comb and a lip gloss, you know, sticking it down her boot.
Well, she was just a tough Italian babe who was like the wall. You had to get through FIFA.
We were all really protective of each other. I mean, that was the whole family atmosphere. You know, outside was the rest of the world, but we were family.
At the head of the family was Ted Albert, whose leadership the troops believed in 100%.
Ted was instrumental in a lot of areas, you know, and being a very solid character. You know. He didn't seem to be a person who crumbled under cannon fire, you know what I mean?
There was a siege mentality about the band, certainly. You know, I think that was come down the line from Angus and Malcolm, and indirectly George. You had to be on the team at 250%, or you wouldn't be on the team at all.
ACDC toured relentlessly, playing any shithole that would have them. From town halls to tin sheds, they battled bogans and pissheads with sheer sonic assault.
People would be throwing bottles, or they would be, you know, winking at the girls, and the girls' boyfriends would get all pissed off, and there were car chases. It was the Wild West.
But the sound and the songs they forged in the Albert studios were the perfect soundtrack for this wild colonial era.
This big fight started, and then one of the guys that were hanging around in the band got all excited, jumped up onto a table, and he reminded me of Yosemite Sam, you know, with the two guns, 238s, he go bang, 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 bang through the roof. It's like, what the?
They just were like fearless.
Angus was on the top of an amp on the other side. There was Bon on another amp, and you go, God, he could kill himself.
They had a rock-solid conviction that every gig was leading them to greatness. It inspired an anthem of Australian rock, their battle cry.
Got very successful in probably the best way possible, which is to go out and not rely on radio airplay. It's simply one punter at a time, one audience at a time, hand-to-hand combat, you know, taking each hill as it comes. It's like a call to arms.
Soon they'd conquered every beer barn in the country. The battle plan rolled on. It was time for London.
Here we are at Mascot Airport to say farewell to ACDC. Are you going over confident that you can take on an English market?
Yeah, well, we are confident.
Yeah.
We're not overconfident, but we are very confident.
Ted Albert was confident too. He had to be. Just like he did with the Easybeats a decade before, Ted was digging deep to bankroll the campaign.
It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll.
It'll only happen on countdown.
Whoa, hey, come home with me.
Just before they left, Angus and Malcolm met another band of brothers, plugging the long way to the top.
We got to do 3 gigs with ACDC in South Australia. And they said that they thought that it'd be great if we signed up with Alberts and that they would go back and tell Harry and George about us.
Every label in the country had passed on the Angels, but Alberts saw their potential.
Ted had a lot of vision when it came to seeing something in a very raw state. The uniqueness was always something to come up with something that was different to what other people had.
It doesn't matter who you are, we're all
The Angels certainly had something different. Getting it out of them was another thing. To nurture the family's next generation, George and Harry agreed it was time for their assistant, Mark Opitz, to step up and find the Angels' sound.
My God, me taking on a band, am I ready for it? I don't know what I showed in my eyes at the time, but I was scared shitless. And so I said, yeah, of course I'll yeah, of course I'll do it.
I was in Adelaide and I was sitting in my car actually, and I didn't even have a guitar, but I heard it in my head, I Ain't the One.
Smokers choking in the smoking room, fishes in a fish tank, sailors waiting for the tide to turn, shoot that ship sank.
And I just, oh my God, that's it. That's it. And that's how I was playing, and I was, you know, and I don't get real excited in the studio. But I'm jumping up and down, going, oh my God, that's it. This is it. This is what we're looking for. That the 8 feel. And so we then transposed that to many other songs in there that they'd written. Voila, we have the Angels.
I ain't the one, I ain't the one, I ain't the one to judge.
I Ain't the One was the first track recorded on the Angels' breakthrough album, Face to Face. And the songs kept coming.
We would record a track, we'd mix a track, we'd get George and Harry to have a listen, and if they liked it, then the final thing was to go upstairs to Ted. And he'd, I think, take a cassette of it and go down to his car and have a listen there as well.
Face to Face sold almost 300,000 copies in 1978. It catapulted the Angels to stardom. With ACDC in England, the Angels were fast becoming one of the biggest bands in Australia, the rising sons of the Alberts family.
They just tapped into, you know, the rhythm of the suburbs, and they sang simply and directly, and the rhythms were there, and bang.
With two rock bands on top, Ted Albert decided to change gear. Time to dust off George and Harry as pop stars.
The morning was cold and lonely. City lights old and grey.
The song was called Hey St. Peter. And immediately, you know, Ted already like, hey baby, you know, get onto this. What are you going to do with it? And he says, well, we don't know. We can't find anybody to do this. He says, well, why don't you do it yourself?
Hey St. Peter shot to #1 in the Australian charts and made a big splash overseas.
The Hey St. Peter single was pretty big in Europe too, wasn't it? In Germany or somewhere?
Yeah, it did quite well over there. I think it's still knocking around the charts in some countries over there too.
Holland, Belgium, France, and all those places.
The B-side, Walking in the Rain, became an even bigger worldwide hit for Grace Jones 2 years later.
So they were two #1 straight away, which probably never would have seen the light of day if it hadn't been for Ted again, you know.
They were more than just a flash in the pan, because next it was time to create a new music genre. George and Harry's love of drum loops was taking them in a new direction.
In the studio at Albert's, you'd look on the wall and there'd be 3 or 4 nails with all these different lengths of tape hanging off them. That'd be all the different drummers they had.
Oh, babe, you left me standing in the rain while you were sitting down to dinner.
George would often play the drums and Harry record onto tape loop.
Drummers were a big frustration for George and Harry because in those days, it was very hard to get a drummer to play a straight beat, you know, no fills. It was like trying to get blood out of a stone, you know, asking a drummer to sit there, just play that beat for 4 minutes. And they go, chuck, 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 no, 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 not da-da-da-da. But I feel like going da-da-da-da. Yeah.
While he was getting closer,
They were making tailor-made hits for the Albert artists.
It wasn't unusual to walk in and see George and Harry with tape hanging around their neck that they'd cut pieces, because you used to splice everything, take something out, but they'd never throw anything out until they were sure that they didn't need it anymore. And so you'd have little bits of China pencil on something and they'd be looking at pieces to stick back on, and you'd end up with tape all over the place, but they knew exactly what they were doing.
oh, babe.
Their love of tape loops would lead them to invent Australian disco.
Oh, babe, you left me standing in the rain.
It took Europe by surprise. In 1978, John Paul Young climbed the charts in Belgium, France, Holland and Germany with Standing in the Rain. On the other side of the channel, the great hopes of the Alberts business were now engaged in the battle for Britain.
Welcome to London. This is Doug Crawford here for Countdown. And look, your mob are over here. ACDC, the lads themselves, chatting away in a corner here at Covent Garden. I'm going to get Angus and Bond to tell me about your tour over here. What have you blokes been doing? Can I get you to come down and have a look at our most attractive part of town?
I thought this was it.
By the time ACDC arrive in London, the whole landscape of the music business has already begun to change. Punk rock has come in. It's the new sensation in London.
This is the sound. This is the sound of the suburbs. This is the sound
As critics frothed over the Sex Pistols and The Clash, ACDC were mocked as wallaby rockers. But the lesson of the Easybeats had been, hold your nerve and don't change for anyone.
A lot of bands start to change because they think the world's changing around them, and so they should try and keep up because people are going to stop liking who they are, so they've got to try and follow the trends. Big, big, big mistake, as shown by AC/DC. Their brand compass is rock solid in one direction, does not deviate by a centimetre.
The people that come to see us, we just give them the show we give the Australian people, and they took on to us without publicity. The publicity caught up to us, not us to them. Yep.
Are you rich, though? I mean, are you making the bread?
Yep. Sure are.
I just bought Big Ben.
They started out at a tiny dive in Hammersmith called the Red Cow. In the first set, the usual 2 men and a dog were there. But by the second set, the place was packed. Literally, during the intermission, people were going out to phone boxes and ringing their friends.
They were a machine. They were an absolute, even back then, they were a machine, and Bon Scott had a magic to him that you can't put your finger on it. It was just natural. It was, I hate to use the phrase the X Factor, but he had it, He had just charisma just oozing out of him, and he was the most social of the lot of them. And he lent me money, which I never gave him back. I still owe him 10 quid.
Bon called himself the lightning bolt between AC and DC.
Hello, this is Bon from AC/DC.
They had found a frontman that the world would come to love.
Do you know if you ever actually talked to Bon and you gave him his address, he would actually write to you. He used to write hundreds and hundreds of cards. It was amazing, man. Really friendly, ever so nice guy.
Every band's got a writer. The writer is the promoter, supplies the backstage with whiskey, wine, beer, sandwiches, whatever. So when you have your guests, nobody has to pay for anything, right? So I was like, knock on the door, and I turn around, and there's Bon, right? He says, hey, mate, can I come on in? I says, yeah, sure, man, yeah, come on in. And the thing that was really cool about Bon is he brought his own bottle, and he brought his own glass.
The gigs got bigger and wilder, and as punk rock wilted, AC/DC's sound literally shook the foundations of old Europe.
We did a couple of nights in Glasgow that were just insane, because Glasgow Apollo had this reputation for just being a crazy gig, and the balcony was designed in such a way that it moved like aeroplane wings. They got to be able to move. And this balcony would shift 18 inches. And I remember the balcony was moving so much that I ran back into the corridor. It's just going to collapse.
When it was time for an album, the boys always came home to Albert's. George and Harry would produce their first 8 albums, using the formula of recording the intensity of the band raw and live.
It amazed me that Angus did all the same stuff in the studio, and it was deafening, just deafening. At the end of that take, his headphones flew off his head and he was on the floor spinning around. And, the amp had smoke coming out of it, and at the end of the take, like the amp died.
In this Sydney studio, a seismic shift in rock music was taking place. A distinct Australian sound produced by migrant kids made good. One day, the great guitar bands of the world, from Metallica to the Foo Fighters, would wonder how the Albert's guitar sound was created. It came down to being fearless. Next, Ted Albert signed Rose Tattoo.
I'm bleeding up here for you. You gotta give me something, yeah?
We used to think that our volume was sonic exploration, actually, that we were communicating with the gods, that we were trying to create a conduit that took people, dare I say, transcendentally, into another place. And it's the intensity that we tried to capture on tape.
They may have traded the grog for green tea these days, but back then, record labels wouldn't even meet Rose Tattoo, let alone sign them.
But George and Harry went to Ted and said, we've found this really eccentric, different bunch of people. And I think Ted knew better than to judge us by what we look like, to say, OK, I'm listening, I'm not looking. And what I'm hearing, so that related to him. He said, I love your sound. I love what you do.
Alberts took the risk and signed the Tats. George and Harry knew the band had the makings of at least one great song and got to work.
We realised that there was a process going on in the studio, and it was quite magical. And I remember George sitting there with his guitar, with Mick, and they're just jamming. And then all of a sudden, that, and that's almost a John Lee hook. You know, we've got a boogie. And it's a boogie thing, and it's all of a sudden, Bad Boy went from being, you know, like ka-chunk, 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 into this swinging like zap, bap, 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 and it had the hook. Once that riff happened, we knew how to sing it.
I thought that the Angels had some heavy dudes at their gigs. Compared to the Tats, nothing. People used to cross the other side of the street if they saw them. I used to walk around with Angry. It was like partying in the seas.
Alberts, Van and Young, ACDC set a standard for the way that Australians approach their rock and roll, the way we do it here. Rose Tattoo, Alberts again, and they were riding the wave and taking us with them, you know, singing about us.
The Alberts rock sound was established. But a golden age of pop was also beckoning. George and Harry's Flash in the Pan was building a strong international following and predicting the sounds of the 80s quirk pop.
Wonder why it's getting cold at night. Must be getting old. Looks like I'm gonna have to wait a while. What the hell am bored?
At the same time, Albert's former sheet metal worker and spunk in residence, John Paul Young, was charting in Europe and needed a follow-up hit.
I mean, thank God for Standing in the Rain, because it gave us a direction, even though it was only a B-side. You know, but because the Germans liked it, it gave everybody a bit of a pointer. Oh, so this is the way we should go.
Quite often an idea would lie around for God knows how long, because we couldn't somehow finish it or fake it, whatever was needed, you know. Lovers in the Air was an example of that.
When George came up with a riff that climbed to the chorus, the idea that had laid around for years suddenly came to life.
Down, 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 there, 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 you know. Ah, yeah, of course, Lovers in the Air.
Albert said to me, I've tried putting words in there. I don't know. I don't think it suits. He said, just do something. Just dum-de-dum something. So that's where that came from.
George said, take all the mixes up to Ted and play them to Ted and let him choose.
Well, he got to hear all the stuff we did, you know, and he'd be going through things like, you know, so I like that one. So you knew straight away, you know, I remember when you heard Love Is in the Air, I tell you, he was like, he was beside himself. And I can see why, too.
Love Is in the Air would be Vander and Young's greatest pop success, and for many, their most memorable. It's been covered more than 300 times.
But it's something that I must believe in, and it's there when I call out your name.
But not even Shirley Bassey in the Bahamas could nail it like John Paul Young.
Love is in the air. Love is in the air.
It had taken George and Harry years to crack Love Is in the Air. Same for Ted Albert, with his dream of making a film. It all came together one night out with his wife, Popsy.
Popsy had taken him to see this play, which looked quite fun, called Strictly Ballroom, which the Sydney Theatre Company had put on.
We loved it because it was so quirky and very funny, but very sort of stylish in its own way and quite, you know, different from anything we'd ever seen.
And apparently Ted sat up very straight in his seat and said, that's the movie I want to make.
Love is in the air, in the whisper of the trees.
Strictly Ballroom would mark a rebirth of Australian cinema in the 90s. Not that everybody saw that at the time.
And on came this video of Scrick doing Love Is in the Air. I said, why are you dressed like that? He said, that is from the film. Well, that's not going to work. I can tell you right now, yeah? How wrong can one be?
From tattooed bad boys to baby-faced balladeers, Albert's was riding a wave of success. But no family is unbreakable. And at Albert's, the Angels would be the ones to prove it.
For all time, I will regret what happened. We left Albert's. It was a huge mistake.
Inspired by the success of ACDC, the Angels were desperate to crack the international market. But their manager, John Woodruff, felt Albert's weren't moving quickly enough. When he signed a deal with American label CBS, it didn't end well.
One of the most unpleasant meetings I've ever had was after George called me. I was down in Melbourne. I said, what are you guys doing? And I came back and had a chat with Harry and George, and they were pretty upset with what happened.
Woodruff offered Albert's a share in the deal, but Ted was angry. The Angels were cast off the Albert's label.
Rick and I don't think we fought hard enough. We should have fought harder to can that idea. But there's also this thing like we could conquer the world. And, you know, ACDC and George and Harry were always talking about that, you know, about the world. And we went for it too, but we didn't have them anymore.
The Angels would have some success in America, but the long way to the top hadn't got any shorter, only lonelier. ACDC knew there were no shortcuts. They landed on the beaches of America, ready for the hand-to-hand combat of what they'd been through in Australia and Europe. Their first tour of America was in a station wagon. but they did 200 shows, often 2 gigs per night. Taking America was an enormous job. Bon felt like they were winning the battle.
So many ideas for songs and so many good riffs. It's going to get better and better. I can't see an end to it, It's like infinity rock and roll.
Back home, Ted wired cash to keep them afloat. But he was facing pressure from his chief financial officer, Brian Byrne. The campaign had been running for 5 years now, and ACDC still had not returned a profit on their investment. Ted had complete faith in the band. He asked FIFA to fly the Albert's flag as they performed a landmark gig in the US.
July of 1978, I go to see them Oakland's Day on the Green. 60, 70,000 people, I can't remember exactly. They're the opening act for Aerosmith. Unbelievable. The most amazing show. They got out there at like 10 o'clock in the morning and they killed it. And the crowd just went nuts.
At the time, Aerosmith was the biggest band in America, with rock god frontman Steven Tyler and lead guitarist Joe Perry.
Do I love Steven? Yeah. But, honestly, Joe Perry can't stand up to Angus. Sorry, Joe, but it's the truth. So that's gonna hurt, but, probably he'll hate me. But he hates me already, so it doesn't really matter. The truth is that Angus is fucking amazing. That's all I can tell you. He's of the people, for the people, by the people. Just like Abe Lincoln said it, he gives it 100% high energy. Perfect name, ACDC, electric.
By 1978, word of ACDC's power as a live act was spreading. It got the attention of Atlantic Records' young new president, Jerry Greenberg.
When you see a crowd reaction and then you see a band live like that, let's just say the light bulb went off in my head and I got it. I said, this is gonna be our next big band.
Greenberg's plan was simple: get ACDC on radio. For him, that meant a new producer to get their music to sound America-friendly. George and Harry graciously stepped aside, as Ted had done for the Easybeats 12 years earlier. In came Mutt Lange to give their music a new commercial skin.
I just knew that if we had made the right record, if we can get the right record made with these guys, they were going to be enormous.
His wish was about to come true. Bon was working on a song about the relentless hard graft of touring America, what Angus called the highway to hell. Bon's sometime girlfriend, Pam Swain, was on the road with the band at the time.
Bon was really excited about Highway to Hell. So the moment I got on the bus, headphones are on and we go through all the songs, and that was terrific. Because I knew they'd been struggling to find the hit as well. That was a big pressure on them. He was writing letters going, oh, I've got to get a single, I've got to get a single, I've got to get a single. What's a single? Who knows? Who knows what the audience will like?
Highway to Hell was the single and the album that woke American radio up to ACDC.
I just got a new stereo system in my office, right? I turned it up as loud as I could. I actually cracked the window in my office. Oh my God, what a record that was.
Jim Delahant ran A&R at Atlantic. First he signed ACDC, then the Tats.
I liked the roughness. They were rougher than ACDC, actually. Raw, yeah, very raw. That was another Australian thing. I mean, it's like Australians can take a rock and make something out of it. Oh, they were really good.
And I heard that record, I said, great, let's do it. And we signed them.
Jerry Greenberg was willing to do anything to sign them, even take his clothes off.
He realized that there was a raunchy side of this band that hopefully he could get across over there. I mean, Rock and Roll Outlaw and Bad Boy for Love were really
interesting songs that you know, that rocked.
The Tats inspired a generation of American bands like Motley Crue and Guns N' Roses.
The Yanks don't get it because they don't understand authenticity. They don't play like that. No one attacks a guitar like in Australia.
The ACDC juggernaut was now rocking at top speed. But the hard living was taking its toll on Bon Scott.
On the surface, all his dreams are suddenly coming true. Highway to Hell has become a platinum album in America. It's just taken ACDC to exactly where they wanted to go. And the very next album is going to be the big one, the really big one.
In January 1980, the boys were working on what would become the Back in Black album when Bon called FIFA at Albert's.
He told me he was excited. He'd heard all the riffs that Malcolm and Angus were coming up with for the new album, and he couldn't wait to get into the studio. He just said, this is going to be a big one. He said, some of their ideas are amazing.
It was the last time she heard Bon's voice.
Lead singer of the rock group ACDC was found dead last night in a parked car in South London. Scotland Yard said the body of Bon Scott was discovered by a friend who had left him in the car hours earlier to sober up after a day's drinking.
I was in the office when George and Harry came in and told me that they had heard about Bon. He loved the whole Albert family. He used to call it his family. And he became a really close friend of mine over the years, and I was only looking at some letters yesterday. I've got about 20 letters that I've kept over the years, and one of his last lines was, you know, I always smile when I think of you, and I thought, that's exactly how I feel about him.
The young brothers thought Bon's death could be the end of ACDC. Atlantic pushed hard for the band to keep going, but Ted Albert told the boys that he would support them, whatever they decided to do. At the funeral, Bon's dad, Chick, encouraged Malcolm and Angus to find another singer and keep going. And so another chapter began.
It was just something they just all sat down and they said, let's just do something, because otherwise they were just going to peter out, I suppose. And they just said, let's go and rehearse some singers and see what happened.
They always had great musical intuition, but no one expected them to go with the singer from 1970s Top of the Pops band, Geordie.
It was just a strange day, you know, I was downstairs playing pool and now I'm upstairs with all these singers.
One of our crew guys was downstairs playing with him and had said to him, well, what are you doing here anyhow? He said, I was told to come here to audition, you know, for the band ACDC. He said, well, that's upstairs, you know.
Hello, this is Brian Johnson from ACDC, and you're watching Countdown 81 right across Australia. See you, man. See you, sport.
I had said to Malcolm after we had heard him sing, I said, he'll be able to hit those high notes. Yeah. And so, and he did, he hit those high notes.
Brian Johnson became part of the family, making Back in Black. Then came the tour. It was time to face the home fans, where the long way to the top had started.
When I saw them at the Sydney Showgrounds, the first gig with Brian out front, the way they handled that gig and handled the transition between the two singers, man, I don't think any band's done it any better.
Back in Black did what Malcolm Young had set out to achieve from day one. It made ACDC the biggest rock and roll band on earth.
Malcolm just knew what he wanted from that band or what he wanted to achieve with the band, and he never veered from that. He and Angus started it, and then with Bon, you know, it just took off, and then with Brian coming in, you know, it's just been an amazing journey.
It was the ultimate triumph for Ted Albert, who had focused his life's work on building a musical family around the people he believed in.
He put his money behind us, he took a big risk, and he never put pressure on us at all. He was a real player. We've worked with other record companies since then in different countries and everything else, but I don't think we've ever met anyone who was so genuine and honest and that you could trust as a person. And we certainly owe Ted a lot, because we may not have been here today if it wasn't for a guy like Ted.
It cut both ways. Ted Albert's dreams started with the Easybeats. 15 years later, ACDC and the Australian sound of the suburbs now ruled the world. In 1990, as ACDC toured the Razor's Edge album, Ted sat down to write one of his regular letters to Malcolm.
Dear Mal, I'm completely blown away by the new album. I love it. In fact, I had subwoofers installed in my car in honor of it. Congratulations on songs, sounds, and performances. Thank you for our long association and the success that you have brought to my company. My very best, Ted Albert.
A week later, Ted died of a heart attack. But the music lives on.
Ted's legacy is, it's many things to many people, but his most important legacy, I think, in the music field is what he did for rock and roll and giving Australian rock and roll respectability worldwide.
Countryman